Ron Nevison is a legendary engineer and record producer who has had a career that has spanned well over 50 years. He has worked with such acts as The Who, Led Zeppelin, Bad Company, Heart, Lynyrd Skynyrd, Candlebox, and many more. Collectively, his records that he has worked on have sold over 100 million albums worldwide. And today he is my guest on the Sonic Road podcast. Here he is, Ron Nevison.
Where are you? Midwest, Ohio, or where are you?
I'm in Ohio, in Cleveland.
In Cleveland. Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Rock and roll city, you know?
For sure.
I'm sure you've been here.
I have. In fact, not too often, but I've passed through. I remember doing a live record with UFO.
Oh, really?
Recorded Cleveland, Youngstown. I was in that area.
Okay.
Chicago. For what the heck was the album called? Can't remember.
Yeah, you've done quite a lot, man. I've gone through a lot of what you've done. So what I've done is gone through and just picked some of the ones that I'm familiar with, and there's quite a few of them. But before we get started, I researched you a little bit. I researched your early beginnings, and I know you started as a singer and you went into live sound engineering, and then from there you went into studio recording. Is that right?
That's right. Yeah.
So how did the live sound engineer transition into the studio engineer for you?
Well, a little bit of the background. I'm from Philadelphia,
Okay.
And I was singing in bands, but it was mostly doo-wop bands in the mid 60s. And I decided I was going to try my hand at concert promoting.
Oh, okay.
So I promoted a concert for Vanilla Fudge in Allentown, PA.
Wow.
And I had to hire a sound company as part of the rider on the contract.
Okay.
And so I hired this company called Festival Group. I became friendly with their owner, and he hired me later on to start working in sound, which is what I wanted to do.
Right.
And so it took me a couple of years to build myself up to a well-known front of house sound guy. And then by the late 60s, I was doing tours with Jefferson Airplane, and Steve Winwood had a band Traffic, because you're familiar with.
Oh, yeah.
So Joe Cocker, Mad Dogs and Englishmen.
For sure.
In fact, I was at Woodstock with Jefferson Airplane doing their sound.
Amazing.
Yeah. So somewhere in that summer, I was with Chris Blackwell, who's the head of Island Records, and he was also Traffic's manager, Steve Winwood's manager. And we just had a conversation in a station wagon going from gig to gig, probably in Ohio. I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah, it could have been.
It could have been. And yeah, I said, hey, I'm really burnt out from doing this. Well, this was the 60s. I was driving the truck as well as humping the gear as well as doing the sound. I wasn't riding in a private plane with the band or anything like that.
Right.
And so I was pretty burnt out. And I told him, I said, I don't know how long I can do this. And he said, well, what do you want to do? I said, what I really like is I'd really like to take what I've learned mixing live sound and go into the studio. So it's funny you asked me about the transition, because he said, well, I have a studio in London, Island Studios, and you can work there. And that's what I did. So that was a fairly big moment. I pulled up stakes, left my job at Festival Group, and started working at Island Studios as a second engineer. So I knew a lot about sound. I knew I was a tinkerer as a kid anyway. I was always building radios and stuff like that.
Right.
I just didn't know how it applied to recording. I knew microphones, I knew effects, I knew preamps, I knew all that stuff, but I didn't know how to record stuff. So when I got to Island Studios, I had a leg up a little bit on the average starting person at the studio, because I knew a lot about it. I'd been around. I was also at that point maybe 24, 25 years old.
Right.
So I'd spent a bunch of years on the road here. So that's how I got into the engineering part.
What were your first records, or did you do singles, or was it full albums at that time?
Well, as an engineer,
Yeah.
Oh, well, I kind of worked at Island Studios just doing sessions for a while. And I'd been there probably 6 months, and one of the bands called me up on a Friday night and said, "Hey, can you do a session tomorrow for us? Our engineer got sick." And I knew that I wasn't really supposed to do that, but I thought, what are they going to do? Fire me?
Yeah, yeah.
Fire me.
And they did.
So yeah, so here I am in London, jobless. So I answered an ad in Melody Maker magazine, which is kind of like the Billboard of UK at that time.
Sure.
And I went to work for a company called Track Plan, which was owned by Pete Townsend. It was a company that was building studios for musicians.
Right.
They had built Pete's own studio, and they were building different studios. Pete was really close with Ronnie Lane from the Faces, and Ronnie. They all lived in the same area in the Richmond, Twickenham section of London. One of the things that Pete wanted to do was Ronnie had asked him to build a remote studio in an Airstream caravan, Airstream trailer.
Mhm.
And Ronnie had bought the shell of the trailer while he was on tour and sent it back. And I was guy hired to like make that into a recording studio.
Wow.
So I did. In 1972, I finished that as an 8-track recording studio with a console and speakers. And you can still find that LMS, Lane's Mobile Sound, online. It's still around.
Yeah. Is the trailer still around? You'd think that'd be in a museum by
The
now.
trailer, it's still around,
Wow.
as far as I know. And maybe that was last year anyway.
Well, they need to get that in the Rock Hall.
Well, so the reason I'm bringing all that up is because you asked me what my first stuff I did.
Mhm.
Pete was also building his own studio for the album Quadrophenia.
Right.
He wanted to do a quad album, and there wasn't any quad studios.
Right.
A quad requires quad panners and 4 channels and 4 speakers and lots of technical stuff.
Right.
And so he decided to build his own studio. So he had ordered this console, which wasn't there yet. The studio in a Battersea section of London was like ready to go, but the console wasn't.
Right.
And he had to start recording. So he called up Ronnie Lane. He said, "Ronnie, can I use your remote truck, your caravan, your Airstream to start recording the Quadrophenia thing?" And so Ronnie called me up. He said, "Get it over there." So I guess really it was a great break for me, but who better to kind of run the session than the guy that built the studio?
Right. Yeah. Okay.
I got the job of starting the Quadrophenia album.
Right.
And I guess I did a good job because they kept me.
Yeah. You definitely did. I actually just listened to Quadrophenia for the first time in a number of years just to refresh my memory on it. And it's such a good record, man. It was so long. And I was thinking while I was listening to it, how it's just, I almost got a little overwhelmed because I was thinking about your story and how they hadn't, the quadraphonic thing was not developed. And that's kind of what Pete wanted. And you guys are working out of a trailer. It's like, how was that for you? Did it wasn't recorded
Well,
quite.
here's the story. At that time, the parent company for the Who was MCA.
Right.
And they had these converters, not converters. They were boxes that took the stereo and made it into a fake quad.
Mm.
And so it wasn't discrete quad, 4 channels. It
Right.
was just like an out of phase kind of quad. And partway into the recording process, we tried it out. And Pete said, "Hey, man, I am not going to make a quad album that sounds worse than the stereo."
Right. Right.
The front to back separation was like 3 dB or something. It was just like a big mono. It was not very good.
Right.
And so we abandoned kept the whole idea of Quadrophenia anyway was this one guy, Jimmy,
Right.
who was quadrophrenic instead of schizophrenic. So he was he was like the summation of the four members of the Who, all
Right.
like,
Right.
and so we just abandoned the whole quad thing. We just went stereo. So there wasn't any quad sound effects anyway. I was out recording train whistles and rain and hoping to get some thunder, but
Yeah.
you don't get much thunder in the UK.
Yeah.
So yeah,
So the people that don't know that are listening to this, Quadrophenia is a concept album, and that leads me into my next question. Were you there when they were the story was probably already pretty much constructed, but writing lyrics for a story, for individual songs that are telling a story can be quite a challenge. Were you there for some of the hashing out of the lyrical side of that album, or was it pretty much all done?
he had pretty much finished it, and not only that, he did a lot of demos
Yeah. Okay.
because of the nature of synthesizer in those days, and there was a lot of new synthesizer. Pete had this ARP 2600, which was modular. It was these big modules. There
Right.
was no button on it that said save. And to get a sound, you had to dial it in. There was a booklet to get like string sound, and you dialed this oscillator and you dialed that, and you put this on this, and until you dialed the sound in. And once it was dialed in, you couldn't save it. You had to go to another sound. You had to totally tear it down and
Tear it
start
down.
over.
Yeah.
So he had his own studio at his house. So what he'd do, he'd do a click, and he'd do a rudimentary guitar, bass,
Okay.
and drums that he did himself. He tried not to make the bass part too difficult or make the drum part too difficult. He wanted to leave a lot of room for Keith Moon and John Entwistle to really go to town.
For sure.
Then he'd do all the synthesizer. And then we take that demo on the songs that he did a lot of synth, and we'd play that back in the studio with a click track, and they'd play to it. They do overdubs to it.
Right.
So mostly all those tracks were already done before I got my hands on it.
Gotcha.
Lyrically, it was pretty finished. I don't remember if but there's a process in recording where, the vocals are probably the last thing you finalize.
Sure.
So I'm not sure if he had done that or not. It's like only 50 years ago.
Right. Over that now. It's crazy.
Yeah.
Oh, you say click track. That really surprises me because were a lot of bands using clicks back then? It didn't really seem like it. And for a drummer like Keith Moon to envision him using a click track on his drum.
Well, if you remember on Who's Next and Bob O'Reilly, they worked with a sequencer.
Yeah.
And so they had done that already on the previous album, and they had toured with that. And so he played with those
headphones.
Those kind of sequencer effects.
Yeah.
And so he was getting used to it.
Okay.
But he's such a wild guy, Keith, and the way he played.
Yeah. Yeah.
We had to tape the headphones around with gaffer's tape around his head to keep the headphones on.
I thought it was because he couldn't hear them. I'd heard that story, and there's video of it. You can see him in a studio somewhere. Yeah. He's like, it's going to town.
Yeah, no, that's because he couldn't keep the headphones on.
Well, that's really
on.
Yeah, that's very genuine. He wasn't going to just slow down.
Sure, he did on tour. I did one tour with them as their sound man.
Oh wow.
Later on, during the Tommy film, which is the next project I did with the Who, the remake of Tommy for the film.
Okay.
And during that summer of '74, I think it was, in between making the album, they did I don't know, 6 or 8, I think 8 gigs in France.
Okay.
It was a lot of fun. We left on a Friday, did a Friday night gig in France, stayed over, did a Sunday night gig in France, and came back Sunday night. And in private plane, stayed at the Georges V Hotel in Paris.
Sure.
Each weekend, and so that was pretty cool.
Yeah.
At that point, they were touring with the Quadrophenia album.
Right.
And
didn't Skynyrd open up that tour in America? Their
Oh, I don't
first.
know about the American part. I
Oh,
just
oh,
did the French part, and
yeah.
there wasn't, yeah, they didn't do that. But Skynyrd was on their label, MCM
Right.
is. And I remember going with Pete Townsend to LA to master Quadrophenia, and we stayed at the hotel. And when we went to MCA to the record company to say hello to everybody, I saw this placard that said Lynyrd Skynyrd with the weird
Yeah, the name. Yeah.
coloring. No, no, what's that? Well,
It's a bizarre name.
produced an album in '99 with that weird name.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I got him on the list here.
Um,
But going back to the Who, I'm a drummer, so listening to stories about drummers is fascinating, especially somebody, a character like Keith Moon. Do you remember your first impression of him when you first met? Do you have any stories to tell about when you guys first met each other?
how long is this podcast?
We can go as long as we want.
I have a lot of stories about Keith.
Yeah.
I can whittle it down if you like.
Oh, sure.
Firstly, I spent more time with Keith than anybody. Firstly, Quadrophenia took a hell of a long time to make.
Yeah. How long?
Lots of track, 8 months.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that's long for that back then, for sure.
Yeah. And we had some time off in between, but during that time, Pete had two young daughters. Roger lived out in the country. And John Entwistle also had a family. But Keith was kind of on his own, and I was kind of on my own too, a single guy at that
Yeah.
point. And so he used to take me into town, basically get in his limo and go to Tramp's Club and do stuff. I did stuff with Keith a lot.
Yeah.
So I got to kind of hang out with him more than anybody else.
Did you help him drive the Cadillac into the swimming pool?
Well, that's a difference. That was in LA. And no, I didn't, but I did. I was living in Beverly Hills, and this is in 1977 or 78. I think he died in 77 or 78.
Yeah.
But I was asleep, and there was a knock at my door, and it was an electrician. And he woke me up at 3 o'clock in the morning and said, "Keith said you'd pay this." And
You're
he had knocked, he had some big speaker cabinets from SIR that he got drunk and he knocked them into the swimming pool and it blew out his electrical system in the house.
I
And
bet.
so he called an electrician and didn't have any money to pay him. So he said, go to my producer's house, right? He sent him up to my house. And yeah.
I would have sent him to the manager over
Yeah.
there.
No, he had in London, he had this stretch Mercedes limo with a driver. And so at least he wasn't driving himself around, which is great.
Yeah, that would have been a little bit dangerous. How was he in the studio when you guys were tracking? Was he pretty focused, or did you have to kind of rank?
He was for the Quadrophenia sessions. He was not ready to do the Tommy sessions the next year.
Oh, really?
And so Pete decided, because of Keith, that he wouldn't. In other words, he felt bad using another drummer,
For sure. Yeah.
Lee Jones or whoever we use. And we thought that Keith would be upset at that. So he decided to kind of use guest musicians for everybody to make Keith feel better.
Oh, okay.
So we had guest bass players, we had guest guitar players like Eric Clapton. And I think that kind of helped Keith feel
better. He didn't really have to get his stuff together there.
He was on his way out at that point.
Was he? That's such a shame, because I was thinking about Keith and his style of playing. And if I was just thinking about it, these days, he's the only one that could have pulled off the style playing, because up to a lot of bands, it probably would have came off as a little bit of overplaying. But for the songs, his parts were perfect for those records. And it's kind of hard to articulate, because some drummers are so special that way, like Keith being one of them. And Phil Rudd from AC/DC, everybody really geeks out on him.
There was history. There was history of like wild drummers, like Mitch Mitchell.
Of course, yeah.
And of course, Ginger Baker. They all had that kind of constant rolling motion of drumming.
Right. Which not a lot of people can pull off, especially in rock and roll and those types of songs. So
Right.
yeah, what a special guy, what a special player. Yeah, and you just kept going after that. So was it Bad Company and then Led Zeppelin, or was it vice versa? Because I was reading up on the Bad Company record, the first one, the debut record, which I actually just purchased the reissue of that. And it sounds, I purchased it on vinyl, of course, but it sounds amazing still to this day. How did that relationship come about? And what was that experience like recording that debut record? Because it was so huge. I was reading the success of it was so quick. I had no idea. It went gold in the first month, and this is a new band. I guess it was a super group at the time, but still the immediate success of it was, it's kind of astounding.
Well, I got a call to, and I am assuming that it's because of my work with Quadrophenia and the fact that I had built this remote truck for Ronnie Lane.
Right.
A call from Zeppelin to come and do the sessions, which would become Physical Graffiti,
Right.
in a place called Headley Grange, which is a place they had recorded before.
Right. Zeppelin 4, right?
Yeah, it was Houses of the Holy, and yeah. And so they had worked there before. They already knew kind of like the whole, what they wanted.
Right.
They were pretty specific about it. And I went down there to record, brought the studio down, went down, and John Paul Jones, for whatever reason, couldn't make the sessions. Some for personal. I never actually found out why, but he couldn't. So we spent 3 days like doing Elvis songs and stuff like that.
Oh, yeah.
And rehearsing a little bit, but not doing much. Just still waiting for him to come.
Right.
And so then I got a call from Peter Grant, who's Zeppelin's manager, and said, "You're familiar with Paul Rogers?" And I said, "Yeah." He says, "Well, I've just kind of signed those guys to my Swan Song label." And the group it didn't have a name. It was just the Paul Rogers Band.
Okay.
And it was Mick Rouse from Mott the Hoople and Simon Kirke from Free, and
Right.
Paul Rogers from Free, and Boz Burrell. I can't remember what his band was for now. And so while the Airstream was at Headley Grange, they came down the next week and we worked for 10 days and whacked out those initial songs that they kind of had ready to go. And I went from there into Olympic Studios, and we did some background vocals and a couple of solos and mixed it all in, like, I think the recording took about 10 days to do the initial recording, very simple stuff.
Yeah, right.
And the mixing another 10 days. So within 3 weeks or 4 weeks, we had finished that. And then I went back to Headley Grange to start the Physical Graffiti tracks. At that time, I don't know if anybody knew that it would be a double album, but
Right.
at some point in the recording, they decided to take some tracks from Houses of the Holy that they had done and other tracks and finish it like that. But what happened, as far as I can remember, because of the delay of John Paul Jones, I couldn't keep working with them because I had a January deadline of starting the Tommy film, which I really wanted to do, and
Right.
was sorry that they messed up their schedule. But so I called up. I said, "Look, I can't continue working on the record," and they weren't really happy about that. I guess nobody quits Led Zeppelin, right?
Right. Especially at that point.
Yeah. And so, but that's what happened. That's what I wanted to do. And I started doing the Tommy thing. And so I don't know what happened after I left in terms of, but it wasn't until the album was finished that I knew there was other songs that were going to be considered and
Right.
all that.
Yeah, that's, it's hard to say, but it's probably one of my favorite Zeppelin albums, 3 and Physical Graffiti. Again, what were the first impressions of those guys? Because all these guys like have this wild lore about them. Or were they all like truly like that, or were they more subdued in the studio, more subdued when they're not on the road? Pretty focused.
Pretty focused, I would say. The Who and Zeppelin at that point had done multiple albums.
Right.
Kind of, and so they weren't like a young rock band. The Bad Company guys had also, Mott the
Right.
Hoople had done albums,
Free.
Free had done albums.
Yes.
So they were all pros. And so I think things got crazy at those. Look, the Who had their own studio, and basically Headley Grange was a rented house,
Sure.
that everybody stayed at. And I had to leave Headley Grange after a couple of weeks of recording because they were waking me up at 4 o'clock in the morning. And so I talked to Peter Grant. I said, let me go back to London and come back in the morning. And he agreed that would be better. I'd lock up the studio, and
Right.
so they wouldn't rave all night.
Right.
But just that's rock and roll, right?
Yeah, that's a strange time. So they were going to bed, or they hadn't been to bed yet.
Well, basically, I finally figured that out because I'd never met this guy, Charlie, because they would say, well, what time's Charlie getting here? But so you know what Charlie was, something that kept them up.
Oh yeah, right. Of course. Well, they got a lot of stuff done.
Normally, yes, they did get a lot of stuff done. Yes.
How was working closely with Jimmy Page in terms of producing and kind of, I know you were the engineer at the time for him. What was his process like for that record? But how
Right.
did he work with you?
Well, a lot of times they'd come in for a playback from the house and
Right.
he'd run over and pull his fader down because he didn't want anybody to hear the mistakes that he made.
Those are
But
scratch tracks anyway, probably.
yeah, right, exactly. But I didn't do the majority of the overdubs on those albums, so I can't really say.
Yeah.
Whereas on the other albums we talked about, which is the Bad Co album and Quadrophenia, I did not only all the recording, but I mixed them myself too.
Okay.
So I didn't have that much experience with Jimmy Page.
Okay. Well, it's still boots on the ground.
So
You're probably a lot.
he was the producer, just like Pete Townsend was the producer. With Bad Company was the producers, but they
Right.
were asking me what I thought about everything. So I just didn't have the producer credit.
Well, yeah, most producers start as engineers too, but I think the reason why too is if
There
you're
you go.
your own music.
Some do,
Yeah,
do.
right, right. Not everyone.
I don't think like David Foster was an engineer.
Yeah.
There's a lot of producers that are musicians that.
Well, yeah, Rick Rubin too. I don't think he was an engineer either. But even if there's a band producing themselves, they have somebody else in the room with fresh ears. It seems helpful because you're too close to it. And
Like, what was that like?
right, right, for sure. Yeah.
Listening back to, you mentioned you just listened to the first Bad Company. I wish that he had pushed himself a little harder on the vocals because he's such a great singer. There's a lot of like, loose stuff on that record. It's a great record. Don't get me wrong, and I love it. But listening back, I would have had him do more.
Were you a part of they did the reissue pretty recently, and they had a bunch of unreleased studio tracks on there. At least I think they were unreleased because I'd never heard them before. Like Little Misfortune. What a great song. There was a bunch of
Little Misfortune.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I did those. I did all those. Yeah, I did their first 3 albums.
Right. Yeah, I was looking into that. Yeah. But some of my favorite Bad Company songs are not well known. My 2 favorite off Run with the Pack are like Simple Man and Do Right by Your Woman.
Right. Yeah.
And I'm not sure if they were even on the radio, but they were so good, man.
Well, the second album, after the success of the first album, the second album, I rented this castle called Clearwell Castle in Wales, or out at the west end of England. And we recorded that album, the Straight Shooter album, at this castle. And then I went to, I think, Air Studios to mix it.
Okay.
And then the third album, the one you just mentioned, Run with the Pack, I think they were so filthy rich by this time they couldn't stay in England because of tax purposes. So
the Stones did the same thing.
Yeah, right. We recorded in the south of France.
Yeah.
But I don't think, I think, and I can't remember really, people have asked me this before, why we didn't use the Ronnie Lane mobile, but I think Ronnie didn't want it to go to the continent. He didn't want it to go overseas.
Oh,
'Cause-
really?
yeah, I think that's the case. It could have been it was booked already. I don't know. But we used the Rolling Stones truck for the third album.
Oh, okay. So the Rolling Stones and Mobile Rep Studio. That's right. I forgot all about that one. I was new to the Ronnie Lane one. At the beginning, when I was looking into it, I thought it was the Rolling Stones one that they were using, and I had read that actually, but I guess that's wrong. Yeah. So there was more
Right.
than more than one.
Yeah, that's what we used in Antibes, which was where we rented a house. But if you're familiar with the south of France, it's packed with tiny little houses all over the side of the hill.
Yeah.
It's like what Malibu will be like in 200 years.
Yeah.
Uh,
Or sooner. Who knows?
right, or sooner. So when we got the truck there, the house that we rented, we couldn't fit the truck up the driveway.
Hmm.
I flew to Montreux, Switzerland, because there's a studio there, just to check out that studio.
Hmm.
While I was gone, they had rented another house in a town called Grasse, which is kind of famous for perfume, I think. Maybe 20, 30 kilometers from where we were staying. So we actually rented two houses. We recorded in that house in Grasse and stayed at the villa in Antibes for that third album.
Seems like there was a lot of recording in houses back then, which is a really cool idea, and I've done it myself. But
Yeah,
why do you think that is? Just the studios just weren't vibing enough?
there's a lot of reasons. One is you have your own environment.
Yeah,
There's no,
probably.
if there's no big thing like record plant over the door where you feel like you have to perform.
Right.
You can get unique sounds by trying different places and different rooms in the house.
Sure.
A lot of different reasons. I love it. I used to even when I moved back to LA in 1975, I rented the record plant truck for a couple of Babies records and
Okay.
UFO records. I kept doing remote recordings. I loved it.
Okay. Did you do any other work for the Zeppelin label at the time?
No,
Yeah, it was just them, huh?
just Bad Company and Zeppelin. Yeah.
Okay. Okay, one more question because I'm a drummer. I feel like I could talk about John Bonham all the time, but have you seen the recent documentary Becoming Led Zeppelin yet? Have you had a chance to watch that?
No, I have not. I need to see that.
You should watch it, man. It's really good because it's only about the first two albums.
Right.
And
That's not why I didn't see it, but
it was done very well. Hopefully they'll do more of this, but they did it with an unreleased John Bonham interview, and all three members were talking separately. And then at one point they were listening to John talk, and it was like he was there. It was done really well, but he was just so young, and they were all so young on those first two records. They were kids, and to be fully formed musicians like that, especially John, because they're all icons, but John's gone, so it seems to be a little special. What was his approach like? Did he have to do a lot of takes with you, or was he pretty much rock solid? You just do one or two takes and it's move on to the next one.
there was no messing around with him. He knew what he wanted. When I set up where he asked me to set up in the hallway,
Yeah.
where he had successful recordings on Houses of the Holy with I'm trying to think of who the engineer was, but so he kind of knew what he wanted, and I started putting mics around the drums. He said, "No." I said, "Well, look, just in case." No.
Yeah.
On two microphones over I don't know, the first landing
Yeah.
of the staircase that went up around the entryway, and use those just a stereo pair, and that's
Yeah.
what the drum sound is on the 9 songs that I recorded on Physical Graffiti.
Yeah. It's surprising. You get in a good room, you get big drums or in a room. You don't
Oh.
need much usually, unless if you're playing heavy and you're playing hard like he did.
Well, the trick is to have a drummer like that
Yeah.
and to walk around the room and find a place where the drums seem to mix themselves.
Right. That makes total
A
sense.
place where everything sounds even, you know.
Right.
You don't want too much bottom end, you don't want too much top end.
Right.
You know, where everything sounds like it's mixed. And that's where you put the mics.
Right.
And so, yeah, it worked out.
Yeah.
And so the drums were recorded on just 2 tracks, left and right.
Wow.
And the only other part was the actual day we did Kashmir, which was called Driving to Kashmir, the title, the original
Right.
title, was the day I got my first Eventide phaser, right? And so I had heard that it was really cool on cymbals. So, well, in this case, I
Okay.
didn't have a cymbal mic. I just had 2 mics.
Right.
So I took one side of the drums and put it through the Eventide phaser and recorded it on a 3rd track just
Uh,
to check it out.
yeah, yeah.
It was the Kashmir tune. And so they liked it, and it became part of the track, and it's still on the original recording. I was just messing around with my new toy.
Yeah.
It became part of the track, and I didn't know until I heard the final mix that they had used it, because I wasn't part of the 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 final overdubs or the mixing on that. So
Well, that's pretty cool. That's your stamp on there probably then.
yeah,
Kashmir is one of their biggest songs and
yeah.
one of the best, I would say. It's hard to say because a lot of their stuff is really good.
But it does work phasing good on cymbals.
Yeah, that's the iconic Kashmir sound right there. It's the Ron Nevison stamp there.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's awesome.
The accidental stamp. Yeah.
Yeah, well, accidents are sometimes the best thing. Going into studio for me personally, it's like you think a song is going to sound a certain way, and then when you go into studio, it changes for whatever reason. Because you're in a different room, you start tinkering around with it, and then when it's done in the mixing phase, you're like, oh, I didn't think it was going to sound like that. But that's kind of, I think that's the fun of being in the studio sometimes.
No preconceived ideas about how far things can go or what they can.
Right. Right. Awesome. Well, I wanted to move on to Heart for a minute because I'm a big fan of Heart. Help me fill in the gaps. I've read a little bit that getting out of the 70s into the early 80s, was that band struggling a little bit? Was their popularity waning, and then you came in and revitalized them with a more up-to-date sound? Is that how that went with them?
Well, they came out of the box with Dreamboat Annie.
Right.
I loved them. I thought this chick that sings rock and roll, and
Yeah.
her little sister, this great acoustic guitar, and
Rips.
had great riffs, don 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 don, and all this stuff, and it was great, right? Well, the guy that wrote those riffs was the original guitar player in the band. The girls had relationships with those guys, the drummer and they broke up. The band broke up, and after I think that except for maybe Boston, they had one of the biggest albums of the late 70s with that Dreamboat Annie album.
Mhm.
And so by 82 or so, they were just doing albums with not the same, I guess, combination of elements that they needed.
Right.
And Epic dropped them. And Capitol Records wanted to sign them. They called me up, hey, would you be interested in working with Heart? Because I had had some big hits with Survivor, big ballads, and
Right.
so the girls wanted me to do a couple of ballads with them.
Okay.
So I flew up to Seattle, and they picked me up at the airport, and we had dinner, and we talked about doing work together. And I flew home, and the next day, my manager said, "Hey, must have been good because they want you to do the whole album."
Oh,
I said, "Wow, okay, great." So really the deal was Don Grierson, who is the head of A&R
wow. Mhm.
at that time for Capitol, said to them, "Okay, as long as we can agree on songs, mutually agree on a producer and songs, I'll sign you." And so they kind of like they had to,
Figure it out.
yeah, they had to, yeah. So, but listening to the songs that they presented me at that time, this is in 1984, knowing what I knew about AOR radio and CHR, which was contemporary hit radio, which was really the way you sold albums in those days.
Right.
It was single radio.
Mhm.
I didn't hear the kind of singles that were necessary to get them past a gold record.
Right.
Right. And so I came up with some great songs that were hits. These Dreams, I never suspected that would be a number one for Nancy, but
Yeah,
I
that was a big one.
wanted her to have a big say in it. She wasn't the lead singer, but
Right.
and because we had big hits with What About Love and Never preceding that, it gave that third single some legs. So yeah, that was a gigantic record.
I saw them like 4 or 5 years ago, and they were amazing. But I think they really only played. They definitely played These Dreams. They did kind of change it up a bit, but they sounded great at the time.
It's okay. It's okay to change it up. It's okay to
Yeah.
make it your own and
Sure.
change it up and have it grow.
Right.
But
Yeah. You know what I wanted to jump to? This is one that was interesting to me. Candlebox. You had done Happy Pills with them. I know
right.
we're jumping quite far ahead in your career, but that's a favorite record of mine too. I saw them on that tour, and we were big fans as kids because I was born in '77, Gen X. So Candlebox was a big band for us when we were kids. And then they kind of changed their sound a little bit on each record. I went from the first to second to the third, and they're all very different. And I thought Happy Pills was probably their most cohesive album, the sounding all from front to back. And that's initially where I got your name from, being a kid back then. I was like, who did this? This sounds so good. I recently talked to Dave Cruson, the drummer on that record,
Yeah, right.
and we talked about you a little bit. So how did you hook up with those guys, and what made you want to work with them?
Well, I think their Maverick was their label and Madonna's label, and they got a hold of me. They were fans of stuff I had done. I'm not sure now. This is mid '90s, I think.
Yeah, mid to late '90s, I think that came out.
Yeah. And so I don't think anybody really understood in the music industry the grunge factor. They
Mhm.
just knew it was selling records. I don't think they understood it when Nirvana popped, and then it was almost like the floodgates open, like what happened in Liverpool when the Beatles popped.
Right.
And Candlebox is one of the ones that came through that portal. And I don't think the record companies understood the grunge at all, and they didn't. So they didn't have the guys that did their demos did their albums because they didn't really have anybody that understood
Yeah.
the whole way things were being done.
Right.
So, and that's what happened with Candlebox's first album, and it was much bigger than the album that I did, of course.
Sure.
But I think at some point they wanted a more. I listened to the previous album before I worked with them, and I couldn't. I remember thinking it's so quiet.
Mhm.
Why? And for one of the first things I said, hey, I just listened to your. I don't remember what the name of the record was, the one before Happy Pills. I said,
Lucy.
but it's like really quiet, like a few dB down, and compared to the other stuff I'm listening to. And they said, well, our producer said we didn't want it too loud because the radio, when it gets on the radio, they compress it. And I thought, what a lame thing to say. Shows you how little he actually knew about producing anything. And so that gave me an indication of like what they had gone through here.
Right.
And so I had a great time with them. And Peter, great guitar player, all of them.
Yeah. Great band.
Great drummer too.
Yeah, Dave's awesome. Good guy. Really good feel.
In fact, I took him to a studio in Sausalito that I used to kind of be the chief engineer of at the record plant in Sausalito. It was a room that was remade by Metallica.
Okay.
Great drum sound in there.
Yeah.
So it was fun to work there with them.
Was it on analog tape, or did you guys were doing the Pro Tools by then?
No, it wasn't Pro Tools, I don't think.
Straight to tape.
It might have been, though, digital. I've been working with the Mitsubishi and Sony digital machines
Okay. Oh,
in the late 80s.
right.
And so by early 90s, I would have think that's probably what I was using, like a Mitsubishi 32 track digital, but not Pro Tools.
Did you do pre-pro with them, or was
Yeah.
it cashed out? Yeah,
No. Went up to Seattle and they had a rehearsal. Spent
okay.
a week or so doing, yeah,
Pretty pro with them.
yeah,
Yeah, great record, man. It still holds up. Every song on that is
yeah.
fantastic. That's probably my favorite Candlebox.
Sometimes is a song I remember, and
Yeah, that's a great one.
All Right with Me. That was another song.
Yeah, 10,000 Horses, the intro song.
Horse is pretty cool. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Very good job.
Stuff. Good stuff.
Yeah,
Yeah.
very good. And then we'll get to Lynyrd Skynyrd. That was the other one I was curious about, and I'm a huge Skynyrd fan. I'm one of the guys that's Ronnie Van Zant, of course.
Yeah. Sure.
Bouncing back to the Who real quick, did you ever run into them? Because they were touring with the Who. Their first big tour in '73 was with the Who in America. Did you ever run into them back in the '70s in any capacity?
I
No.
did not. No.
Yeah, it was
I
kind
know
of.
I had a tragic accident that happened in the late 70s.
Yeah, and then the reformed band there was still a handful of original members at that time. The drummer was Kenny Aronoff, correct?
Well, that's the drummer I used.
Yeah.
Yeah. I brought Kenny into the project. In 1980, I did an album with the Outlaws
Okay.
called Ghost Riders in the Sky album.
Right.
And the guitar player on that, Huey Thomason, then became one of the Lynyrd Skynyrd guitar players.
That's right. I forgot about that.
So that's how I actually got the gig, because Huey wanted to work with me. And when they were looking for somebody to do this album in '99, they contacted me, and I flew down to, I think, Sarasota or somewhere in Florida, and had a meeting with them, or Fort Myers, I think, down to Ricky's place. And yeah, and we ended up deciding to do it in Nashville because everybody, good studios, they could drive there from Atlanta. Most of the band was living in Atlanta. So we had a great time in Nashville. It was the longest I'd ever been in Nashville. I was there for like 6 weeks or something. And so, yeah, it was a fun time for me. I brought Kenny Aronoff in as the
Right.
drummer, and the rest of the band was the band at that time.
Did they still reflect that insane work ethic that the original band had? Because they would just go over and over the songs like 8 hours a day until they were just these machines. Did they still like carry that with the new lineup when you worked with them? Was it all
Well,
of
I don't know, but I don't even
they would have killed it?
just remember highlights of it. I remember going to Ocean Way in Nashville and recording the drums with Kenny, recording the basic tracks, and then we moved down to a studio in Franklin called The Castle, and where it was just like a real private place.
Right.
And I did all the overdubs there, and then I flew to LA and mixed it with the band. But I was living in Beverly Hills at the time, and right down the street from my house was this park and a little lake in the park. And that's the lake where they had filmed Happy Days. No, not Happy Days. Andy Griffith's show
Okay.
with the Opie and
Wow.
them fishing. And when I told Skynyrd about this, they begged me to take them to this lake.
I bet. Yeah.
While we were there mixing, I took them on a trip to see this little lake down the road
That's
to my
cool.
house. I thought it was cute.
Right on. Yeah. That's awesome.
Yeah.
Well, what else are you working on these days? Are you still making records, or are you
Yep.
still? I knew you're still doing studio services for folks. Do you still do you sing in engineering for independent bands and things like that?
I do. In fact, I do a lot of mixing because I have a studio upstairs here at the house.
Okay.
So I do a lot of mixing, which I'm kind of a single dad with a 14-year-old daughter. So it's easy for me to just drop her off at school, go upstairs. These days, I never really thought about how easy it would. I can't imagine having a big mixing console with
Sure.
the 24-track tape machines these days. People email me audio files. I mix them and send them back, and they pay me on PayPal.
Sure.
I never talk to them. We just converse over email. It's a brand new world for me here.
Yeah, it sure is. I'm being
But I still fly. I'm just finishing up now a record that I started way back in September with Jim Peterick from Survivor.
Okay.
It ended up being 2 albums of duets with a bunch of different people, guys and gals, just mostly all his songs, but just like ballad kind of duets. Kevin Cronin's on one, and lots of different people are involved. And so I'm just finishing that up now.
Okay, well, where can everybody find everything Ron Nevison online these days?
Well, one of the main sites is Sound Better. So soundbetter.com
Okay.
with Ron Nevison profile would be
Okay.
a place. Or I have my own website, ronnevison.com.
Nevison.com.
Yeah.
Thanks for talking to me today, man. I really appreciate it. It's been a thrill to talk to you. You've done a lot of records that I love and listen to and own. So I really appreciate the time today.
Okay. All right.
All right, take it easy.
All right. Thanks.